this sounds kind of like a hard ass thing to say, but like if an experiment is really, really successful, but we initially thought it was going to be like slightly successful and just like a small incremental thing. Of course, celebrate, let's be happy and all that. But like that also means that like we didn't really understand to what extent this experiment could have an impact, which means we either didn't understand the channel that well, which means that we didn't understand the audience, or we didn't understand how people were going to react to it. Yeah, there's just another level of analysis to be like, why was our prediction off?
Hello and welcome, listeners and viewers of the Hypergrowth Experience. I am your host, Nima. This episode is a little bit different. I'm having one of my co-founders come on and talk to you all about the process that we run at Pearmill for growing companies. And if you don't know, I help run a company called Pearmill. We are a growth studio helping startups scale through paid acquisition. And we spend tens of millions of dollars a month. And it's been a process that we've been working on for quite a few years now. And I hope you find it interesting. It's in a world where you cannot run perfect experiments, but regardless, you need to have some understanding of where should you put your next dollar? Are you doing the right things? Is this the best way you can allocate your capital across all these different channels that are at your disposal? And Karim's been the one designing that process, and we had a pretty good conversation about it, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you're watching the video version, he's he was working out of our office that day, and he's in our artist in residence room, and the paintings he has behind him are from one of our artists in residence. Her name is Aida Murad. She's one of our favorite folks who's been able to use our office to produce and is quite talented. So we'll leave her site in the description as well if you'd like to check out her work. Anyway, here's the episode on the growth process at Pearmill. The first question for you, Karim, is at like a very high level, how does the overall process work? Like how do we think about experimentation and learning from the work that we do?
I'll start off by talking about how this process isn't necessarily inherently a growth process. I don't think that we're necessarily the first people to apply this type of process to a growth problem. So the process is much more like a scientific process. And the reason we're thinking about this from like a scientific standpoint is because this model has already found a way to define some rules in our universe. So when scientists run experiments, and I'm going to talk in super broad and vague terms, but like when scientists define experiments, they're trying to understand more about the rules of our universe, and in whatever capacity that is. And not to sound self-important, scientists are way more important than us, I'd say, and much less paid, and But in a similar parallel, the rules of performance marketing, or the universe of performance marketing, isn't really that defined. There's channels that have their own motivations, their own intentions, that have their own like tech behind them, that are kind of black box, and people even at the channels don't really understand the channels themselves as much anymore. There's people who are seeing our ads who have behaviors and patterns that oftentimes could be like seen as like irrational and changing. And so our job as performance marketers is to operate within this space of ambiguity. And one thing that helps us operate in the space of ambiguity is to try to define it more. And so our process, the reason that we run experiments, it really isn't about the results. It's about defining our universe more so that we can then understand the space more and then get better results. So ultimately, yes, but it's just about definition. and something that happens a bit differently than how scientists approach this problem is that the rules of the universe, generally speaking, don't change, but the rules of like performance marketing changes quite frequently. So the channels change quite frequently. People's behavior changes. People get used to seeing certain types of ads that used to be like really good and you see get people, but now people understand that these ads are trying to do certain things. So people change. So what's cool about our space is that we continuously have to run these experiments to try to define the universe. And it's not just like one moment in time we have something defined and that's it. We continuously have to run it, which is part of what's so cool about the space in general, about being a performance marketer. It's also part of what's really annoying about and frustrating and stuff. But
I was going to say, I was just on another podcast and they were asking me, how do you keep up with everything that changes all the time? Because it seems like very annoying and frustrating. And and I think it depends on what your perspective is. I think that's interesting. It's like a constant source of learning, but it can also be annoying because then what you had going and was working for a whole company for a whole year, all of a sudden doesn't work anymore.
Totally. It's the duality of performance marketing. So the long airy fairy monologue aside, and just to answer a question more directly, the reason that we run this process is so that we get a better understanding of what we're trying to do, of what we are capable of doing in the channels, and learn for our accounts what is best in order to get them the returns that they want, whether it's improved CPA or improved ROAS.
And before we go through the overall process, so it's there's two layers to this, right? We're trying to learn what works for a specific brand that we're helping, but we're also trying to learn what works at like a more one level of abstraction removed, which is like what works at the channel level, let's say, right? Okay, so walk us through how we think about the process overall, and we can get into how we can think about these like two levels of abstraction of experiments.
I'll touch on it briefly, and then we can revisit it a bit later. But there's experiments that we run as an agency. There's experiments that we run that are to try to understand the general space. So we'll use one account as the account that lets us experiment some initiative that we may want to apply overall. We want to apply the learning from to all other accounts. And then there's some experiments that are just purely account specific. They can't really be applied to other things. So the process, the steps of the process, the breakdown of it is quite straightforward. And again, I think I've seen so many people talk about this process, like Andy Johns, Balfour, and we've taken and adapted to our systems. But steps are basic. First step is ideating on ideas. I don't want to call it first step because it's a cycle and you can't really there's no first in a cycle. But a starting point that you consider is ideating on what initiatives or experiments to run. And this is where we hold either like brainstorms or like breakout discussions where we try to focus on a really specific problem. Like how, rather than like, how do we just get more users or how do we lower our CPA? It's much more specific. Like, how do we decrease the drop off between marketing qualified leads and sales qualified leads? How do we lower our CPMs for this period? It's usually about a very specific metric or set of metrics. And from this ideation step, we have a backlog, goes into step 2, which is our prioritization, where we go through and we prioritize what we want to start off with first of the experiments and initiatives that we talked about. What do we want to actually spend the time and resources doing? This is probably I think this is the hardest step of it all. I should go into like the breakouts of it, but predicting what's going to happen is basically what we're trying to do when we're prioritizing. And it's a skill that's really hard to like hone. If you're really good at predicting, then you don't have to really worry about prioritization at all. And so you have to think about like, as we're in that step, we have to try to get much better at prediction. And part of our process is about that, just generally building the prediction muscle.
If you were very, very good at predicting, then you wouldn't even need to run the experiments if you were 100% correct every time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It depends on your head rate. If you're at 100%, then why are you experimenting? Just go for it.
We need like the precogs from the Minority Report.
Yeah,
to
exactly.
be marketers. That's what we. And then the step after that is super simple. Is just just do it. Like after prioritize, just do the experiment, run it, execute. That's the. I think in our docs when we write it, I think that step is just like 2 sentences. Like just do what you just said you would do. Then it goes into the 4th step, which is after it's run its course, analyze what's happened. Look at the performance that came out of it. How close was it to your predictions? Was it successful or not? Why do we think that whatever happened? If it did well, why did that happen? If it did poorly, why did that happen? And then the last part is systemizing this. And by systemization, we essentially mean that if an experiment worked well, how does it no longer become an experiment and just become part of our account structure or part of our playbook? And if it doesn't work well, how do we use that to then talk about, or how do we use that to feed into the ideation phase? So whatever learnings we got from it, what are the next steps that we would take along with this experiment? And the reason that last step is really important to the systemization of it is if you're onboarding people into your growth process, if there's a new hire or if there's somebody who hasn't been a marketer that's coming onto the team, you can get them to read through this like systems book of history of experiments that have run and the track record to really understand the process up to this point, and understand what they need to do next in either the account or the company.
Yeah, and I really want to talk a bunch about that because I think that's probably one of the hardest areas on how to convey the learnings, right? But let's get into the ideation. What is it hard to come up with new ideas all the time? Do we run out of ideas a lot? Like there's many vectors to this, I assume, right? There is the creative part, there's the structural part, there's the audience part, there's all these like, I guess maybe start with what are the vectors in which you guys ideate on and think through running experiments in?
Yeah, you already named a few of them, like audience tests that we could run, creative tests, landing page tests, off-channel tests, and this goes more into when we work directly with our clients for them to have certain lifecycle flows that work with certain groups of audiences we come through. There's tracking tests that we can run, so like event optimization tests. Like what events are we trying to optimize towards? It never really feels like there's a shortage of ideas, especially when you have like multiple people on a growth team. Even our brainstorms don't always involve just people on that pod or on that team. We invite like creative folks, we invite engineering folks, or suggest that if you're running any brainstorm, invite people who haven't been as close to the problem. The times that the shortage of ideas can happen is when it's around one specific problem. And there are times where it's just like, I don't know what else we need to do in order to get this problem solved. And that's the part where it reaches a point where we feel like we can't solve this problem, and then the mentality shifts into, okay, we just have this problem forever now. We're like, how do we accommodate for it? Like if you think like you have some handicap, you're not trying to beat the handicap, you're trying to live live a life or run a process or with that in mind and accommodating for it.
Can you give an example to this, just so you can clarify it? Like a form of a handicap that effectively you'll have to live with on an account level that will probably be there for a long period of time, or if not forever.
It's one that we're dealing with is, and actually comes up quite a lot, is increased competition in a space. I think this comes both seasonally and just depending on the industry at certain points in time. So if you think about from competition from a seasonal standpoint, and especially if you're in the e-commerce space, Q4 and end of Q4, everything gets way more expensive because all the retailers, all the e-commerce shops, all the big brands, they're all pushing out their holiday messaging, their holiday deals. And what happens is that CPMs go up as a result because people are bidding for the same inventory and are trying to go through massive budgets. There's nothing that you can really do about that. You can't you can't find a way to decrease the cost. No one's found a way to be like, oh, I got it. I got to the cheap CPMs and got to like my own inventory that no one else is targeting. So you have to start thinking about other ways to accommodate for higher CPMs. Things that a lot of retailers do and a lot of advertisers do is just deals, discounts. I know I can get more conversions if I only have 1,000 impressions that I can get to with my budget. I'll just use like realistic numbers in this case, but if I only have 1,000 impressions that I can get to with my budget, and typically that 1,000 impressions is worth $20, and that gets me 4 purchases. It's now worth $40, and the mentality should be, okay, how do I get it? Rather than how do I get that $40 down to $20, it should be how do I get 8 purchases out of the 1,000 impressions I'm doing? So deals, improving conversion rates, adding other touch points from maybe other cheaper channels. You have to switch so that you're not trying to solve an unsolvable problem. It happens a lot with Google too, where we see all of a sudden new competitors have come in to bid on terms because it's a really hot space, like behavioral health space or mental health space. A lot of competitors are starting that space.
There's this new like VC funding being pumped into the space, so you just have to deal with the new folks coming on.
Yeah. Unless you find some like Machiavellian way to get other people to stop bidding on your terms. But
we've talked about, like, I don't know if we ever ran this experiment, but didn't we say, like, what if we overbid heavily for a while to scare the marketers away from like a keyword or something like that? I don't know if we ever ran that experiment, but I just thought it was like a funny thought experiment to go through, because there are humans on the other side who are looking at the data, exactly. So you can like scare them away. That's an interesting one. So there is like a systems level things that you can't like really control sometimes, and you have to live with them, and so you have to find ways around them. But otherwise, there's like plenty of room for new ideas all the time to go through. The process goes, we have all these ideas, and the vectors are like wildly different, right? So there's like some of them are on channel, it seems like, right? So there is new pieces of creative we could be running on, like, let's say Facebook, new sets of keywords that you could add to Google. There's like all these channel ones, and then there's a couple you talked about that are not even on channel, right? So there's like landing pages or life cycle flows, and then you somehow have to prioritize between them. Do we run them all sometimes at the same time? How do you prioritize when they're like wildly different and in different platforms? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, like I said, that's really that is the hardest spot. And we've used a few different scoring methodologies and some like intuition methodologies. And each one is maybe a bit better than the one before, but it still feels like there's hasn't been something that's like really nailed down how we prioritize. The main thing that we want to watch out for is experiments that would affect each other. So like you said, if we're running a landing page test and a creative test at the same time, it's a bit risky because we're not really, whatever the results are, if we drive the same audience through those same 2 tests, whatever the results are, we're not really understanding what cause the change in behavior, whether for better or worse. And so we either have to stagger the tests or totally isolate the audiences and have different groups of people go through it. The only caveat that I would say to that is if you're pretty early on, I wouldn't worry as much about having like really clean experiments that don't bleed into each other or overlap into each other. I would just do more. And even if the results are confusing, you have some results, you have some momentum, you have some action. I think one of my old bosses had told me a while ago this like metaphor that really stuck with me of like, in the beginning you're building a statue and you're not like at the stage where you're like, you have a granite block and you're not going to use like a tiny little chisel and piece away at things. You want to take like a massive fucking hammer to it and like take out big blocks and not really understand how the like physics of the hammer to the block broke off certain pieces. You just want to like make some big impact, and then you could take like some finer tuned things. So at larger scales, we have to be more careful of that step. There's some things that we don't run together, like I said, creative tests and landing page tests. Any creative tests we run against our existing best performing audiences. Really, actually, most tests that we run, if they don't have to do with audience tests, they're running against our best performing audiences. Yeah, not sure if that got to the premise of the question.
I mean, I think it's hard, right? Like there's all these different areas that you could test, but it seems like the most important thing at some scale is to effectively have like clean signals of information of like after the test is run, you just know that it actually succeeded or it failed. And in earlier stages, like that doesn't even matter. So you kind of just go through the motions of this process, and enough learnings will emerge that you will get to the scale in which you can run these like sort of isolated controlled experiments. I do think I think we've been doing this for a few years now, and that seems to be the hardest part. And the good news is I don't know a single marketer that does it any differently. So, and most marketers are even bad at that isolation part. In our experience, right? Like, how often are we talking to clients saying that, no, we cannot possibly run these 3 tests at the same time? I don't know if that's gotten better or worse, but it certainly is always there to some extent, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty frequent conversation. I get the reasons. There's urgency. Like every company has urgency. I don't think we've ever like come across an account that's just like, oh, if we get this learning at some point in the next 3 months, 4 months, well, it'll be a good learning to have. I think everybody's trying to get as many learnings as possible. There's not just the learning risk that's associated with this, but there's or not having clean signals, and there's a risk associated with that. But there's also the risk of the channels not really understanding what's happening and what to do. So I think we talked a bit last time about how Facebook's machine learning is like quite sensitive, and even Google's machine learning to an extent also is getting to be more sensitive. All they're trying to do is learn. And so if the majority of what's happening on an account is all tests, there's no like semblance of successful progress or successful signals happening, then those channels are just going to get confused. So if we take our accounts and like our evergreen accounts and start to test a ton with them, then Facebook's going to lose its ability to say, okay, this is the thing that was steady, and I know as Facebook that I can put more budget into this ad set or into this set of creative, and know that I'm going to get purchases or conversions or whatever we're optimizing towards. So doing too much at once can also doesn't just make it confusing for us as individuals, but it will make it confusing for the channels. And that's even worse because it's really hard to get it back on track. It's really hard to get those channels back on track. Yep.
Yeah. And this is like an interesting one, because I think last time you talked about how there's like some level of humanization now we're doing and just talking to the channels or like thinking about the channels. But on the technical layer, this is just like a fit problem, right? Like the machine learning models trying to fit on what success looks like. And if you don't give them enough time plus data to fit anywhere, they're just going to be constantly in search of a fit. And that results in volatility. So it all makes so much sense to me, right? So we run these tests. Let's talk about the analysis part, because I think this process was popularized by people that were given, by marketers that were given the gift, which was the gift of scale, where they could run experiments and have truly statistical significance after they run these experiments. Working at these massive scale, like at scale companies with lots of traffic and lots of users. How do we think about that? Like, we work with all sorts of companies, but quite often, even if they're spending $500,000 or $1 million a month, you're not going to get significance in that way. Is there a framework we use? How do we think about when we run one of these experiments, just even use an example of like, okay, we run an audience test. How long do we wait? How much money do we put behind it? How do we think about designing the experiment such that after it's done, we can trust its results to some extent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Before we launch, to what you just said, before we launch, we will actually like document how long we want a test to run. So very rarely do we launch a test and we're like, all right, we'll just wait until we get some idea or get some signal of what's going to happen. We will predict we want 500 sessions split between these two landing pages, or we want to spend $700 on each creative in order to get there. And the prediction is less about, to your point, right, like the prediction of like the time that it will take is less about statistical significance, because I don't think we can afford that in a lot of cases. We have to like balance significance with speed. And instead we'll rely a bit more on directional and on confidence. And in this case, sometimes what we will do as a group is, rather than like use stat confidence, like stat sig confidence, we'll use group confidence. We'll use like, okay, we are 4 people who are on this account and have a really good understanding of it. And this includes the client as well. And this test has generally been, showing that this is the variant B is more likely to be successful as smart people, as like marketers and intelligent people who have a close idea of what happens in this account. Should we go for it? And I think that part is a bit, it's in the absence of like luxury of statistical significance, your like intuition muscles or your intuition becomes really important. And I think that comes with time and familiarity with an account, familiarity with a channel, and at sometimes just like a willingness to make a call and make a decision, and trust that at some point you may get opposing information that this test that you had confidence in, that you put all in before it was statistically significant, went wrong, and create a backup plan. Like, all right, we're going to put everything into this right now, but we know that if after a week it actually collapses, it's really easy for us to revert to this because we implemented the test in a certain way where we didn't override a past experience.
So it's like, it feels like some form of like group human intelligence going behind trying to make the decision. And then there was like a reversal path always like planned out when the test is so significant that it would mess up the whole account effectively.
Yeah. That's generally like a because again, the channels are like pretty sensitive. And I think this part is specific to channels, but maybe not as applicable to like when you're testing out email subject lines. Whatever is, if you change something that is working, or if you make an impact on something that is working, it's really hard to go back to that thing. So if we have an evergreen account and we have a set of new creatives that we want to test and we put them in the evergreen account and they tank, it's really hard to get that evergreen account back in the state that it was before it started tanking. So you want to have like separation, and all right, or new creatives, we're going to launch them in some other campaign. And if they do well, we'll put them in the evergreen, but we're not going to pause the old ones so that we have like a track it back option, or is a term for it. I forgot what that term is. Run it back? No.
Reversal?
No, there's like a saying. Two people whose first language is not English.
English, yeah. So trying to figure this out. Yeah, this is an interesting thing, especially with like the understanding that the inputs in which you put into the channels are non-reversible, like they're immutable in some sense. Is that what you were looking for? And so like the state can never go back to the original state in which you were in. So after you change it, you've mutated it to a new state and you cannot go back. And so that's an interesting thing to just talk about like very briefly. And is creative what are the other things we try to like separate out from evergreen campaigns to protect essentially the majority of the budget? So then we continue having some stable state before we hopefully unlock new levels of performance.
Yeah. I'll again just use the context of Facebook because it's a lot more sensitive. If we're not using something like Google Optimize, where we can split traffic at the URL level, then we'll create separate campaigns for landing page testing. If we're doing structure tests, like we want to see the difference between a campaign that runs on a daily budget versus a campaign that runs on a lifetime budget and gets turned off during weekends. We won't do that within our evergreen campaign. We will we'll actually start separate campaigns, and sometimes we'll have our evergreen and then another campaign that is very similar to our evergreen that is running against, that's essentially the exact same as our evergreen, but that's running against the test variant. And yeah, off the top of my head, I feel like those are the predominant ones in bidding tests. So account structure tests, bidding tests, and creative tests. Yeah, landing page creative, we'll keep those separate.
And so, okay, so we analyze, and the analysis part is hard because we're not going to have significance here, but it sounds like basically building conviction over time is the name of the game. Of like, after we've run enough tests around an area, we're going to start building some intuition that, hey, we think this is going to work. We might then, as you named it, systematize it. And the systematization process is it sounds like it was two parts to it. One is just creating the documentation such that new team members or other people coming on can be at the same level of understanding of the accounts. And then the other part is just implementing the thing that was just learned across maybe the account itself or across clients, right? Am I missing anything from the systematization?
No, that's essentially it. It's the process of documentation and then writing essentially just the next step. Whether that next step is applying to everything and having it be picked as part of our playbook, or it feeds into the next set of ideation.
So yeah, let's talk about, I guess, how we track all of this and then how it ends up becoming documented at the final stages. Like, what do we use? How do we think through documentation? What tools do we use? How do we write about them?
We predominantly use ClickUp. And that's where most of the process runs in. But once something is graduated, we also use Notion. We'll talk about the relationship there. But ClickUp, like any project management tool and test management tool, just allows you to create the different stages that something is in. So when we are submitting things in our backlog, there is a backlog column, and all that somebody has to do is just write out what that idea is and maybe a couple of sentences on why they think it might work or why it's valuable. They don't have to like go and fully bake it out. And so if we really want to remove the difficulty of adding things to backlog, or the barrier of adding things to a backlog, because it's super important to keep that full. When something's added, if it gets chosen in the prioritization, that becomes the place where everything lives. That ClickUp card or that ClickUp task is where the experiment design lives, the hypothesis, or like the hypothesis, experiment design, prediction, and then week to week or day to day or whatever frequency of updates on how that experiment is running. And so when we prioritize it, we'll bake it out a bit more. We'll put in one part of our ClickUp card why we're running it, what the hypothesis is, and then how it's actually going to be set up. And when it's actually running, it moves, I don't know if I'm boring people with like the column nomenclature of our ClickUp space, but it goes from backlog to on deck to running. And what we essentially do is on whatever frequency we think it's important to look at that test, whether it's important to look at it after 3 days or on a weekly basis or however long, the test owner will update how it's looking so far and just any findings that they have that we may want to apply immediately, and what the next step is for this test. Sometimes the next step is just inaction, let it run for more. We slotted 2 weeks for it. Our first week, we're seeing that this looks like it's going to perform really well, but we knew that it was a less competitive week. And so we don't think that it's actually, we don't feel the confidence to say that it will do better. Let's run it for this week, which seems to be a bit more competitive. We can see if it's still, it keeps true. And we actually give this, this is a part where it's maybe more interesting from like an client agency relationship. Our clients have access to our ClickUp space. So like whatever we use for ourselves is what we also include our clients in. We're not like creating these slides and presentation afterwards that admittedly are like could be polished and look nice. We're just putting them in there. So at any point in time, they can see what's running, what the status of each initiative is, what the learnings are. And then when it actually is completed, there's 3 things that should be getting written down. One is obviously what the results were, what the final results were, why we got those results, why we think we got those results. So whatever set of analysis that we're going to do that actually explains it, not just like, okay, this was the result, we're happy with it. And then also how close we were to our prediction. Like did it turn out how we expected it to turn out? Yeah, this sounds kind of like a hard ass thing to say, but like if an experiment is really, really successful, but we initially thought it was going to be like slightly successful and just like a small incremental thing, of course, celebrate, let's be happy and all that. But like, that also means that like we didn't really understand to what extent this experiment could have an impact, which means we either didn't understand the channel that well, which means that we didn't understand the audience, or we didn't understand how people were going to react to it. So there's just another level of analysis to be like, why was our prediction off?
So that like the gap of prediction is important. Like if we're close, but like in the other direction, let's say, that's not too bad. But if we're very far off, even if it's in the positive direction, like we thought it was going to be good, but it was great, then there's like learnings that could have been had by just analyzing like what was wrong about your intuition around this. So then next time you do a better job predicting effectively. Gotcha.
And like I said, the reason that we have to build this like intuition and like get this level of closeness is because we can't always, like I said, like rely on statistical significance or things happening the way they should like rationally or logically be happening. And I think our paid social lead, like they were the person that I think probably of the people that runs paid social accounts or like runs like Facebook accounts, seen them use their intuition much more than I've previously and historically seen, and that's gotten to like a pretty high level of success. So that's why this intuitive muscle is really important to us. But sometimes I will admittedly say it is hard to get buy-in on. And I don't know if we've done like really a good enough job of like explaining why this is really important. Our other co-founder, Mary's, used this analogy really well, where she's like, sometimes you can think of a gift idea for a friend and you know why it's not a good gift idea. Or somebody asks you like, hey, I'm thinking of getting this for your friend or for this friend, and you know why it's not a good idea. And you could use your intuition to know that like they shouldn't get it for them, but you can't like logically point out all the things that would make this a bad gift for this person. You can do that to some extent, but there's a part of it that's just like your familiarity and your understanding of it. Maybe we just don't have the vocabulary for it yet, but just feels something there.
It's hard. It like sounds very similar to like if you listen to investment folks, like people that are wielding a lot of money, they do all this analysis, they do like all this logic work, right? And then at the end of the day, they make a call. And then you ask them, how did you make that decision at that time? And they just tell you there was like a vibe, effectively, right? There was like, where it was like, it was just like my intuition telling me that that's what makes sense. And like your intuition basically has all that information in it, right? You've fed it with all this information. If you're just making pure intuitive decisions, like I think that's wrong. But I think what sounds like what you're saying is like, hey, do all the work. Where you like looked at all the data, you've like fed it all into your brain and your body, and at that point your intuition says this is the right move. There is some like level of intelligence that's probably built beyond you being able to like write in a flow chart why you think this is the right move, and we got to be able to maybe explain that to a client, but it just seems like it's working.
Yeah, I love the way that he put that.
Yeah, I guess like the last question is like, how do you organize this? Like, this is the part that is harder. Like, I understand at an atomic level of like, hey, here is this one campaign. Here's an experiment that we ran. Here's what we learned from that one experiment. Over the arc of time, like, how do you make it so that it's easily readable and legible, and someone else coming in can catch up quickly without having to go through every single document and read it? Maybe the answer is read every single document in chronological order so you can rebuild the intuition we just talked about. Or there is like an abstracted way of pulling all these learnings out. Okay, how do we do it from there?
Part of it is leveling it up into larger themes. So if you give somebody just like a list of experiments to run through without, each experiment may have its individual context, but usually when we're thinking of like 3 initiatives or 3 experiments to run, they are around a similar theme. And there's nothing in like ClickUp that says like, this is the theme. So it has to be supported with other docs. Part of the way that we group our initiatives is around, we do sprint planning. So we run it in sprints. The first week of every month, the first full week of every month, we'll dedicate that to closing all the experiments from the past month, or all the ones that we have data on. Make sure that they're like just sealed, written. We know what the next steps are. We align on what the biggest problems are for the coming month, or just the biggest challenges that we have. And then our experiments are grouped around the next set of experiments are grouped around that. So we actually, usually what's running in the first week is just the carryover from the weeks before, but it's dedicated to knowing what we're going to do in week 2, week 3, week 4, there's sometimes 5 weeks in a month, right? Or the start of 5 weeks.
Yeah, like a portion of a week. Yeah. We promise we can count. We can count the number of months, number of days in a month.
But yeah, it's so that there's that monthly doc that gets written up that has all the context from what has happened before, that has the set of experiments that we want to focus on next, and then or the challenges that we're having, and then the next set of experiments. And so that's a bit easier to get into. And we like to usually encourage people, like if they're getting into, like if they're joining the team, is to read through those docs. It makes it a bit more thematic. The bigger problem, or the other problem that exists though, is that sometimes these are done in the spur of the moment to like have to. We will document because we want to document, but some people have varying degrees of skill of like communication, written documentation. And we haven't really perfected this yet, but what we're finding is going to be important is to have like a re-edit of all the things that we documented. Be like, okay, we're now 3 months removed from this, or 2 months removed from it. Does what's written still make sense? Would it make sense to somebody that's coming into this for the first time? And go through the process of rewriting it with the intention of it being read versus the intention of it being documented. So there's all the things that we can do along the way to that make sure that it's like there and written and documented. But I think we're going to have this other lens on top, which is just a review, a periodic review of what we've written.
Yeah, that seems like an interesting challenge of having now lost all the context. Does it still make sense? Because when you're in it, you have all this like added context of, hey, what's been happening all month? Or like, even if it's like the year, right? Oh, this was in March of 2020. There was this thing called the pandemic back then, right? Like there's, forgetting all the context is probably like a big part of the problem, which makes so much sense. And systematizing that part of going back in time and rereading sounds like, it sounds like a lot of extra work, but it probably makes sense. So then you can like really support new people that come on.
The benefit of that, even though it's extra work, is that you could probably you probably don't need the people who have worked on it to be able to say whether something makes sense or not. Like you can get, it's a bad idea, but like, or maybe not a bad idea, but like you can have like a writer that just like reads through, that has like experience with maybe like a more technical writer to just like go through and clean it up. So I think you can like parallelize that work.
Well, I think we can cut it off there. I think that this process is obviously something we've like gone really into over the past few years, and by the end of it, it's very clear that there's still areas of improvement, and we're going to keep working on it. Thank you for telling the story. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me again. It's always super fun.
Have a good one.
All right.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Hypergrowth Experience. I certainly enjoyed having this conversation with Karim. I run a totally different part of Pearmill. I work on the technology and sales and acquisition part of the company. So I am so grateful to have spent the time with him, learning about the process that the growth team runs so smoothly. And it made me feel a lot better about knowing that we're spending all this money with this thought process and this level of rigor. So I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you want to be on the podcast, or if you want to work with us, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm Nima at pearmill.com. Next episode, I have one of my favorite entrepreneurs on. His name is Ian L. Patterson. He runs this company called Plurilock in the cybersecurity space. And he's one of the most individual thinkers that I know, who's been able to scale a company through a very different mechanism than the average sort of venture-backed company that you may hear about in the press. So I'm pretty excited for that episode to come out. Anyway, thanks for listening.